I'd like to introduce myself as well as what I'm doing here in India. The Asia Cloud Computing Association is really an industry association representing the technology and cloud ecosystem within Asia to the rest of the world, as well as we discuss amongst ourselves best practices and policies that are relevant, of course, to the cloud computing economy. Now, about 7 years ago, we were first instituted, and at that time, it was pretty interesting with the conversations which I was having. A lot of the conversations 7 years ago was, "Hi everybody, my name is May-Ann. This is cloud. This is a new technology. Nobody knew about it. Nobody understands it." So we were doing a lot of introduction to technology work. I'm glad to say that over the last 3 years, what we've noticed is that there have been a lot more advances in discussion along technology and what technology can be used for. And one of the ways in which the members of the ACCA have noticed is that different industries actually use cloud very differently. Obviously, the technology industry is very keen on just pushing cloud and pushing technology, but most of the other industry verticals like healthcare, like financial services, are more interested in what can we use this for. Now, cloud vendors, we're not going to buy cloud because it's the new toy in town. We want to see how we can either better serve our customers, serve our constituents, serve our stakeholders, give us a reason before we actually talk about buying your technology. And we're one of the things which we realized 3 years ago was that the financial services industry was actually a very fast adopter of new technology if it can find a reason to do so. So obviously, real-time trading has to be built on new technologies. A lot of the stuff will be moving on to cloud computing. But we're realizing for cloud in particular, the regulators themselves were hindering some of the adoption. Now, the ACCA, our mission is to make sure that the adoption of cloud computing in Asia Pacific is as smooth and as widespread as possible. That is our mission statement. Because we're a business association, obviously it's got to do with a lot of the adoption. The thing that we've realized is in most conversations that I've had, and this is about three and a half years ago, what happened was that there would be a cloud vendor who would want to sell cloud. There would be a financial institution or a bank which would want to buy cloud. And they said, okay, willing buyer, willing seller. Capitalist system, what happens? Technically speaking, a sale should happen. But a lot of times what the bank or the financial institution would say, "Dear cloud vendor, before we sign on the dotted line, are you sure just to double check, we're definitely going to be adherent to all of the compliance requirements that the regulator is going to have on us. We were safe, right? With all these privacy regulations, we're not even sure what they are." And of course, the cloud vendor, and you can speak to these gentlemen on the back seat here, the cloud vendor is going to say, hold on. We don't do your compliance for you, and you've got to talk to your lawyers and your risk compliance managers before we can actually say, sign on the dotted line. You can't outsource that liability to us. That doesn't happen. So what happened, and what happened is that a lot of the conversations actually moved to the regulator. So they would trot over to the financial regulator in whichever country it was, and they'd be like, "Dear regulator, can we use cloud computing?" And here's what the regulator, this is 3.5 years ago, mind you, would say, "This is technology, right? If this is technology, maybe you should go and talk to the Department of IT or the Ministry of IT or whichever government agency was dealing with the IT. So it's not really us." So the vendor and the bank institution will be like, "Okay, sure." We move over to the agency that handles IT and say, "Dear Department of IT, can we use cloud computing in all of our cloud services, in all of our banking services or financial services?" And they would be thinking, the response would be, "But you're technically regulated by the financial regulator. Why don't you go and talk to them?" Now, I'm Chinese, and we have this term in some of the public policy circles where all my friends are also Chinese. It's called Tai Chi. This literally means you have this like big problem, and you slowly but surely push it over to the other side, and then you define it on the other side, and then you slowly push it to the other side, the Tai Chi happens. And nobody wants to take responsibility over the liability discussion and the outsourcing discussion. So we realized this really early on, about 3.5 years ago, which is why we came to this point where we thought we should actually talk about the financial service regulations impacting the adoption of cloud in Asia Pacific markets. So we started out with some of the discussions. We've already covered all of this. This is some of our other research as well. We worked on this particular report because we realized, again, financial services industries are interested and very concerned with regulatory compliance. They're interested in protecting their business processes and data. But the regulators themselves also have their own concerns. They're concerned with regulatory authority, regulatory oversight, and ensuring that financial service institutions are complying with all of the different regulations which are coming out from different sectors: cybersecurity, customer data protection, privacy. And the confusion and misunderstanding actually amplifies a lot of the concerns that people have, and they don't want to move to cloud because of these misunderstandings and confusion. So we thought that it was useful to actually put down some a report that really covered the financial services regulations in Asia Pacific. A lot of literature about 3 years ago had focused very much on the US and the EU market, and we realized that there was a real paucity of data. One thing which I've noticed as I move out and do presentations in the US and in the EU is that they tend to think of Asia as a whole lump of countries with the same institutional characteristics. But as we who are in Asia know, we are massively heterogeneous. And if we talk about the state-by-state comparisons, that's even more complex and even more complicated. So there's no way to say Asia as a whole. So we thought that in the first instance, let's put down a report that talked about financial services regulations in Asia Pacific. So the full report actually is available on our website. It's available for free. We funded it because we thought it was a pretty useful report. So I'm just going to go through in this next section of my presentations what the report covers, because not only do we have 14 different country comparisons, we actually show you what we're comparing. And I think that these are core issues which are of concern to the regulator, and where a lot of cloud companies and banking institutions need to give assurance to each other as well as to the regulator that these are indeed being looked at. Anything from exit strategies to data protection, data sovereignty issues, privacy issues, integrity of customer data, all of that is actually very, very important. And we're giving a framework by which we can start discussing these issues between the regulator, the financial services institutions, as well as the vendors. One thing which I would love to hear from you before I start on the next lap of the presentation is, are there other regulations that are impacting financial institutions which are not covered by this framework? We've got 9 parameters, but overall, have there been new things which have come out as concerns? So, with that in mind, please, listen to what we have put together. We were looking for clear guidelines. We're looking for recommendations for vendors and financial service institutions to get a deal. And in the report, as I mentioned, we cover 14 different countries, which describes the law and addresses misconceptions and cloud reforms. These are the stakeholders of the report. So we had 14 different countries, hopefully written in a non-lawyer tone where you can actually understand the regulations, and we scored 14 different countries. Key spotlights, let's see. We identified the challenges, the obligations. We identified how cloud services can meet the regulation and business objectives. We identified how vendors can help the banks and the financial service institutions meet the requirements. We also provide specific regulations to match the service contracts, as well as government regulatory reform suggestions. The key issues, and here's where I'd love to hear your feedback on. The key issues. Number one, processes for adopting cloud. Have the governments actually, and the regulators come up with processes for adopting cloud. Now, this can come in the form of outsourcing guidelines, and this is where I think a lot of agencies in the region have started working on updating their outsourcing guidelines. If you outsource something to a third-party vendor, be it core banking services or non-core banking services, for example, what kind of safeguards can you put in? In the same way that, for example, if you were to outsource the cleaners to come into your office to clean the waste paper baskets, that surely has to have some sort of contractual obligation that you have to make sure that the people who come in are safe and accredited, etc. So what are the processes for adopting cloud which have been suggested? Have there been any in the first instance? There should be in general. Secondly, contracts for cloud services, are they prescriptive or are they not? Because there needs to be some way of managing the contracts for cloud services, but I don't think that it's in the position of the regulator to actually prescribe the cloud contracts. I do know, that being a caveat, I do know that some regulators have come up with a sample contract or a sample service level agreement that has been put out into place. But it's usually a sample, it's not prescriptive, not like you have to do this. Data location, are there any data location requirements being put in place which the regulators have demanded of either both the CSP as well as the financial institution? Data use limitations, are you only allowed to use the data for this particular use? Are there any other notification requirements that are obliged to be adhered to by the vendor and by the bank? Data segregation. And data segregation is interesting and important because this is where the Asia Cloud Computing Association, we have started to do work due to the data location requests. Now, a lot of governments right now have been requiring for, if this is Indian data, if this is Malaysian data, if this is Singapore data, as long as it is belonging to the country, it has to remain on country. But one of the things we realized very quickly on is not all data is the same. That's number one. Not all data is the same. So you can't have that mandatory blanket, all data has to remain here. That's number one. Number two is, how can you be so sure that your data isn't already out there? Let me take a very quick example. A lot of banks have notification services available or alert services available on Twitter and on Facebook. Now, that data technically is banking data if you're considered the public relations person to be an employee of the bank and is servicing a banking customer or a potential banking customer on Facebook and on Twitter. Now that's public cloud. That is public, and that's not just public cloud. It's public cloud that's not even owned by you. So that, not that it's not owned by you, but you have no control over that environment. It's a completely different third party. So if that's the second thing, are you so sure that when demanding that Indian data stays in India, Singapore data stays in Singapore, are you sure that you're actually able to get that data back? Because I think that this is a case of, shutting the, what's the analogy? Shutting the stable door after the horse has pretty much left the stables already. So this is a question that we've asked ourselves. So the solution to that we've started having conversations with is on classification of data. How can we start to have a more intelligent conversation about what types of data exist and what types of data should be kept on premise, what types of data could be considered a little bit more sensitive but could be on hybrid cloud, and what kind of data should be allowed to be going out into public cloud because it's not so sensitive. And studies have shown that about 90% of government data, government agency data is actually quite okay to be keeping on public cloud. It's not super sensitive. There has to be a more nuanced understanding, therefore, of how much data can actually be put on public cloud. And secondly, for the more secure, or the information which requires a little bit more security, what sort of security do you want stamped on it? What kind of security levels do you want stamped on it? Because financial institutions exchange information like nobody's business. There has to be some sort of authentication procedures put in place, some sort of tokenization, some sort of encryption being put in place with keys somewhere. what sort of level of encryption do we want on that? And we can't have these conversations until we talk about data classification. So the data segregation issue, very linked with data location, and outside of this report, the data classification piece is very, very important to us, because I think that that's the basis and that's the foundation by which we can start having a little bit more sensible conversations about how to manage data. The audit, review, and monitoring. I think a lot of people, a lot of regulators are very worried about making sure that there is reporting back about how you're managing that data. How do you do the audit? How do you do the review? How do you do the monitoring? Basically, both sides are on, both the vendors as well as the financial services institutions as well as the regulators are all on the same side. Everybody actually doesn't mind being accountable to each other. The question is, how are we accountable to each other in a way which is not too onerous? If you take a big international company that is servicing a lot of banks, let's say a really big multinational bank, if the bank has to get the vendor to be accredited or audited by national certifications coming out of India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, and everybody's got their own national accreditation process, the time that's going to be consumed just doing the audit and the accreditation is going to be, not accreditation, but the audit is going to be extremely high, and the cost that is going to be entailed is going to be very, very big. So we're pushing, our recommendation is always for for the regulators to allow third-party audits to be conducted. Third-party auditors which are internationally accredited, so ISO standards or SOC 2, I think those are the audit standards that we're actually recommending. Cybersecurity, I don't think that I need to talk too much about this. I know that with this year, especially with the Petya virus as well as the WannaCry security breach, I think that is primary concern with everybody, and I think that there's no argument that everybody wants the highest security for cloud services. Business continuity, how do you ensure that banking services continue in the event of a calamity or disaster? It could be a natural disaster. Exit strategies, is data portable from one vendor to the other? How are you managing that data? Is data completely destroyed after one of the customers actually exits your company? How is that managed? So these are the key issues which we feel should be put on the table to discuss when it comes to banks moving onto the cloud, and then talking to the regulators about it. So we've proposed these as talking points. The key findings of the report are that in the first instance, after we looked across Asia Pacific, there aren't any blanket bans. No regulator has come out and said, no, you absolutely cannot use cloud. Everybody says, nobody actually says you can. Wait, hold on. Monetary Authority of Singapore has this interesting picture of the MD, Ravi Menon, actually says that MAS has no objection to cloud. So they actually do say that they have no objection to cloud. But nobody else has actually said no to the cloud. So that's a good thing for us. We think that that's really beneficial. So there's more discussion that can be had about the adoption of cloud. We just want to make sure that it continues to be smooth. Sometimes there is a lack of regulation. Sometimes it's not evident from the regulations about whether or not cloud can be used or cannot be used, because either they're unclear or they're a bit restrictive. Very interestingly, we have in coffee sessions, when I have these coffee sessions with some of the financial services, the banks, they always come up to me and we're over coffee and they're like, actually, just to tell you the truth, some of our services are already sort of on the cloud already. You know, our payroll, for example, which is a non-core banking service. Our payroll is already managed on cloud, and oh, by the way, we're on Google, we're on Google Email, or we're on Office 365. So that's also cloud already. So there are banks and other institutions which are sort of already on cloud. So even though the regulations, there is a lack of regulations around whether or not banks can use cloud, not a lot of banks are actually. Financial institutions actually moved on to cloud already. So again, is it a case where we're trying to close the stable door when the house is already out? Regulations in Hong Kong, Japan, New Zealand, they comport more with our recommendations than other jurisdictions. I'll flick over to the recommendations after, I think it's after this slide, yes. Philippines and China have the most to do. South Korea has recently revised its regulations about 2 years ago. there are more and more regulators which have recognized that they need to allow the use of cloud, but they can't let go, obviously, of the reporting requirement that they have. So South Korea and I think a couple of other regulators have also said, if you want to use the cloud, can you just notify us? Just tell us that you're doing it. We're not going to approve or disapprove, but do your due process, do your due outsourcing, risk management, etc. And if you deem it okay, you move, but you just tell us. I met with the Bangko Sentral Filipinas in October, and they have actually done this process where they say, we will approve. Now that takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of time, and there's a liability involved because obviously the banks can actually turn around and say, you actually approved us to use the cloud. But they're on an approval process at this point in time, and at least one bank has actually applied to move its core services onto the cloud, and it's been approved. So I think that we're seeing good movement on that score, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about what's going on with India on this score. The CSPs, we think that the vendors themselves can contribute to the growth of cloud services with a more nuanced and better understanding of all of these core issues that we've already raised. So we're very happy to make this available to everybody to use. That's why we published it and made it available for free. We do think that regulators continue to play a very, very key role in the cloud adoption. And given that it's a very regulated industry, the financial services industry, this is something which we can't do without, cloud adoption cannot move forward without the help of the regulators. Coming to our 5 recommendations, and just to put this in context, the next page is actually about where India stands here. So I'd love to hear your feedback on that. Our 5 recommendations. Number 1, regulations should be technologically neutral. This is available on the handout that you have on your sheet. So if you can't quite see the screen, you can just look at the sheet. Regulations should be technologically neutral. I think in order to future-proof India and any other regulations, we need to make them technologically neutral. There should not be separate regulations for the use of cloud services. I was a little bit alarmed by a number of agencies which I heard from today in India that says that we may want to consider a cloud oversight committee or a cloud regulator, cloud use regulator, because I don't think that is going to be useful. I think that we can actually be technologically neutral in the first instance. Secondly, the regulations should set out a clear process that should be followed for the adoption of cloud services as if they were any other form of outsourcing. Now, the trend in Asia Pacific is that Singapore, Malaysia, Philippines, Australia, and I think New Zealand as well, have moved into review and drafting or redrafting or additions, amendments to outsourcing guidelines or risk management guidelines. Essentially, again, with the analogy that I used earlier of if you want to outsource your rubbish collection to a different company, you need to have some risk management processes in place where you assess whether or not the company is credible, etc. So in the same way, regulations, we feel, should set up this clear process, but not calling out cloud computing. It should just call it out as like any other outsourcing process. So we should have that approval built into the procurement process. So we're seeing a lot of change in this area, and I'm looking forward to seeing where India is going to be bringing forward. If I'm not wrong, I think that some people are looking at updating the outsourcing guidelines. But there are other technology risk management assessments also that I know probably fall into a lot of different other regulations. So I'd love to hear a lot more detail on that from all of you later on. Thirdly, the transfer of data to other jurisdictions should be permitted subject to appropriate safeguards. I think that the financial industry has always had a lot of information flowing from one jurisdiction to the other. So how do we keep up to date with the requirements for cybersecurity on this respect? Fourth, regulations should only identify the key issues that should be addressed in cloud contracts. They should not be prescriptive of the terms of the cloud contracts. I covered this a bit earlier, so I won't reiterate. Basically, don't be prescriptive of the cloud contracts. The use of independent third-party audits should be acceptable as an alternative to audits carried out by the FSIs and the regulators. A lot of financial services financial service regulators may not actually have the capacity or the time or the resources to spend, auditing everybody who's going to be using cloud services. So we really feel that use of independent third parties is going to be useful, rather than to say, don't worry, we will do it ourselves because we're scared that you're not adhering to our rules. So where India sits is that you can see it's got green for the first two, and we scored it red for the last three. Not because India does not have clear regulations around it, but because they're a little bit more murky than most. So we do want to enable the cloud, obviously, to be procured more easily within the financial services in India. So that's actually part of the recommendations that we have for India, that they work with, that India works on these three recommendations. And if, again, this report was launched in March 2015, so it's about 2 years old. We are just about on the cusp of starting the update, and I would love to hear from you if you've got any updates from me that we can include in the next series of the report. So look at India, use of cloud computing permitted absolutely. Who are the relevant regulators? RBI, MeitY, DOT. Are the specific regulations dealing exclusively with cloud services? No, which is great. Are there any other relevant regulations? Yes, there definitely are. Is regulatory approval required? No. Specific processes for it? Yes, there is actually notification. Are there specific contractual requirements? There aren't contractual requirements, but apparently there is a specific illustrative checklist by RBI which are available. That one I'm not so sure, because I actually I personally haven't managed to actually find the illustrative checklist, but some of my lawyer friends actually said that yes, it exists. So I didn't manage to check that in time before this trip. So a sneak peek of what's actually going to be included in the next round of our updates really is the country updates that TRAI has actually recommended a light touch regulatory approach on cloud services to ease the burden for companies. And there is apparently a new circular that provides an IT framework for non-banking financial companies, which includes guidance on outsourcing. And the yellow bits, which unfortunately I myself can't see from where I am sitting, those are the regulations which we will be adding to the list, which is actually available in our report. So this is really a sneak peek of what we'll be updating on. If I have gotten anything wrong, or if I've been a little bit slow to update anything, please do let me know about it, because I sit in Singapore and I cover all of Asia Pacific, which is, to be very frank, pretty challenging, because we're heterogeneous and there are a lot of regulations which are going around. I do see India as one of the more advanced economies when it comes to dealing with adoption of cloud, because I think that the market is actually very hungry for innovation, for driving entrepreneurship. And I think that there are a lot of discussions which are going on in India about actually how do we onboard more people to using technology. So I don't see that fear right now of technology, we don't want to use it, but rather I'm seeing more of a struggle to see how can we get more assurance and more controls around and in place so that we can trust that there are safeguards for India's financial industry. And I think that we as the ACCA, we are very happy to be the neutral platform to discuss these issues with the government, leaning on our partners with academic institutions such as yours, to be bringing some of these discussions a lot more accelerated to the government.